Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Now in the next few tutorials you may notice a slight difference. Now in this period of uncertainty, I don't have access to my normal recording or baking equipment because I'm also changing location. But don't worry, I've come up with a few back to basic recipes which involves no fancy equipment or ingredients. So I hope you enjoy these recipes, I hope you try them out, and most importantly, stay safe. So being without my normal cake equipment was giving me serious withdrawal symptoms, and so I decided to take on the challenge to make a layered cake without my normal equipment. And I managed to succeed, so I'm going to share with you how easy it is to achieve whether or not you have specific cake equipment. So the base of the cake was my normal chocolate sponge, and for those who have already made my sponge cake before, you'll know how easy it is and you do not need a mixer or any fancy equipment. As usual, I'm going to start off with my melted butter and add some caster sugar and a splash of vanilla paste and mix that together. I'm using a whisk here not to incorporate air, it just makes it a lot easier to mix in. So once the sugar and butter is combined, I can now go in with my eggs. The reason why I love this method so much is because when you add the eggs, no curdling occurs, whereas if you're creaming the butter and sugar, it tends to curdle as you add the eggs. It's also so easy to make this by hand with no machine whatsoever. So I'm going to mix that together until the eggs are fully incorporated. So I don't usually sift my flour because I don't think it needs to be sifted, but when I make a chocolate cake, I sift the flour and cocoa powder together just to combine it. And then start to fold that in and mix it together until a smooth batter is formed. You might want to change to a spatula at this point just to scrape around the edges of the bowl. So the only cake tin I have with me is actually a 7-inch cake. As always, the tin is also lined, and I've actually extended the paper above the rim of the tin just in case it rises too much. So I'm going to pour all of this mixture into the same tin rather than splitting it into two tins, so I get a taller cake. This is also what's so great about this recipe. You can make any quantity of it and put it in any size tin. Some will be more shallow, some will be thicker, as long as you don't overfill the tin because you'll start to burn the cake before the inside's cooked. So you don't really want the mixture to fill more than 2/3 of the tin. So I'd say this is the maximum quantity for this size tin. So the cake's going to go in the oven at 175 degrees Celsius for about 50 minutes, which is longer than I would usually cook it, but because there's more mixture in the tin, it needs longer time cooking. So once it's fully cooked through, I'm going to leave it in the tin for a little while just so it's cool enough to handle. So I usually bake my cakes the day before decorating, which is exactly what I'm going to do here. And to keep it nice and fresh until tomorrow, I'm going to wrap it in some cling film to make sure it's nice and airtight to keep its freshness. Now I am going to make this cake one more time, so I have 2 cakes because I want 4 layers of cake in total, and I'm going to cut each of these in half. So I'm going to do the exact same thing again and leave both cakes wrapped in cling film until tomorrow. So making ganache couldn't be easier. I've heated my double cream until it's steaming, so that's about 75 degrees Celsius, but you don't really need to measure it with a thermometer. You just want to heat it until it's nice and hot. And I'm going to pour this directly over the chocolate and then leave it there for about 30 seconds, and the heat of the cream is going to start melting the chocolate. I'm then going to start mixing the chocolate into the cream for it to combine fully, and eventually you'll get a smooth chocolate ganache. Now this is the same ganache that I use for my chocolate drips. There's no difference. The only thing to bear in mind is that in different countries, double cream or heavy cream can be a different percentage of fat. Also, the kind of chocolate that you're using can also make a difference. When it comes to making ganache for cakes, it's not so important because it's going to set either way. Whereas making ganache for drip cakes, you want the exact dripping consistency, so it matters slightly more. Anyway, so once the chocolate and cream is fully combined, you get this beautiful glossy ganache. And I like to leave this overnight at room temperature. Room temperature being maximum 18 degrees. Because at the end of the day, the chocolate is what's going to make it set solid, whereas the cream keeps it loose enough to spread. If you want to put this in the fridge, you'll have to wait for it to reach room temperature again before spreading it onto the cake. But when I leave ganache overnight, it's always the perfect consistency the next day, so I'd much rather do this if I can. I'm just going to cover it with a layer of cling film and then push it down against the ganache so it doesn't form a skin. And leave this in a cool place until tomorrow. So, as I explained, I left the cakes overnight. I find that cutting fresh cakes can be a bit of a nightmare. They're very soft and very crummy. Cutting them the next day just reduces the crumbs and the mess, and it's a lot easier. Also, you know that the cakes are completely cool. So I'm going to cut the cakes using my normal trimming technique. I'm going to mark around the cake just above where the cake starts to dome, keeping my knife in the same position and turning the cake. Once I've gone all the way round, then I'm going to start cutting inwards, still rotating the cake every time, until I've gone all the way through the cake and the top comes off. Now these top bits can be kept, so never throw them away. You could simply nibble on them or make them into cake pops. And before I cut this cake layer in half, I'm going to use it as a guide for my second cake, and that ensures that both cakes are the same height. So once again, go round the edges, turning the cake until I go all the way through. And now I can cut each cake in half again. I'm going to use the same technique, but this time I'm going to start off halfway, mark around the edge, and then go all the way through. And do the same on the other cake. Now this does take a lot of practice. I've trimmed many cakes over the years, and people tend to find this really hard. So if you're more comfortable with a cake wire, then by all means use a cake wire. But it's good to get used to a knife, just in case you don't have your normal equipment. Who knew I'd be in this situation? So I'm going to soak my cakes in a normal sugar syrup. So this is equal quantities of sugar and water flavoured with a little bit of vanilla, and apply a thin layer to each sponge. And this will keep the cake nice and moist. And now the cake is ready to decorate. So before I set up to decorate, I'm just going to check on the ganache that I made yesterday. So you can see when I mix it around, it's beautiful and glossy. It's definitely thickened up, but still soft enough to spread. So to me, this is perfect to work with. So I'll leave that on the side and set up to decorate. Now, I don't have my turntable with me, which only now do I realise how important one is. But fear not, there is a way of decorating a cake without one. So I'm actually going to use an upside down flat bottom bowl, and that's going to be the surface where I'm going to decorate the cake on. It's moving around quite a lot on the wooden surface, so I'm just going to dampen a cloth and rest the bowl on it, and that should keep it still. And then I'm going to place some towel on top of the bowl and spray some water over that so the cake board with the cake won't move around either. So there's my little trick for a turntable replacement. So I do have a scraper and a palette knife. Not my normal one, but this one will do. And as always, I'm going to start by securing the sponge on top of a cake board, and I'm going to use one of the bases of one of the sponges. Reason being is because that side is extremely flat because that was touching the bottom of the tin. And then go on with a couple of spoonfuls of ganache and spread it over the layer of cake. Now if you are using this turntable alternative, you can see that you can turn the cake as much as you want. Just be careful not to throw it off the side of the bowl. It's happened to me once and I nearly ruined a cake because of it. So just be aware. Once that layer of ganache is nice and flat, I can now go on with the next layer of sponge. So you can see how nicely the ganache spreads out. If it's too thick, you're at risk of tearing the cake or bringing up some of the cake crumbs with it as you spread. So I prefer the ganache being on the slightly softer side rather than the stiffer side. Next layer of sponge goes on and some more ganache. So you can see I'm not piping the ganache on like I would usually do with buttercream. I'm going on with more rough amounts. This cake's going to be quite tall anyway, so I don't want such a thick layer in between. Also, ganache is slightly richer and denser than buttercream, so you don't need as much. For the last layer of sponge, I'm going to turn it upside down so I get the flat side facing upwards. And now I'm going to crumb coat it like I usually would. So spread some ganache around the edges. And some all over the top as well. Now this was quite tricky, especially because the cake board that I was using was quite thin. And also if the layers of ganache in between the cakes were too thick, the cake would slide around a lot more, which is another reason why I kept the layers thinner than normal. So I'm going to make the top nice and flat using my palette knife and then go round the edges with my scraper. And there were times I had to poke it around to realign it, but that's totally normal. I'm going to keep scraping it until I'm happy with how straight the sides are. And then I'm going to clean off the top corners with the palette knife. So from the outside in, with one action, I'm just going to swipe the palette knife across the top and scrape off the ganache, and then repeat that until all the top corners are nice and sharp. So I can see the sides just need a little bit of tidying up, so I'm just going to go over very lightly once again with the scraper. Remember also, this is the crumb coat, so as tempting as it is to get really carried away with this layer being perfect, you are going to go over with another layer. So if you can see some holes or something's misshapen slightly, don't worry too much, because we can always correct it on the second layer. Right, so once you're happy, this can go in the fridge to set. So I'm going to put it in there for about half an hour because I want this nice and solid before I go on with the second layer of ganache. Now the only problem with ganache is that it does get a little bit messy, so when I can, I like to clean off any excess ganache that's on the cake board. And it's easier to do this when it's cold. So the crumb coat is nice and firm, it's not going to move around anymore, so this layer is going to be a little bit easier as well. For the second layer of ganache, I'm just going to use my palette knife and spread on an even amount all around the sides of the cake. What you'll notice on this layer is because the cake is cold, the ganache is going to set, and once again, make it a little bit easier to work with. You may also get the opposite effect, that it becomes too cold and you actually find it harder to spread. This is another reason why I prefer the ganache to be on the softer side anyway. So I'm going to go around all the sides of the cake, roughly keeping the same thickness if I can, and then add more onto the top. And now I'm going to go around with my scraper, and rather than scraping off the excess, I'm just going to smooth the ganache out. So you apply different pressure than you would on the crumb coat, because you're not scraping it off this time. You're kind of redistributing the ganache around the cake, filling in the holes and making it nice and smooth and straight. So a few years ago, I actually played around with textures of ganache and created this tree trunk cake. And because I don't have my normal equipment, I thought to try this technique out again, especially because you don't need anything specific for it. So of course, if you want, you can leave the ganache nice and smooth, but if you did want to try a new technique, now's the time to do so. So firstly, you can see that I'm actually leaving the corners rough rather than going over with my palette knife to create sharp corners, because I think this adds to the detail. And what I'm going to do to add the texture is actually use the handle of a spoon and go up and down the cake, and I'm basically creating grooves in the ganache. Now because the ganache has set slightly to the cake, it's at the perfect texture to do this. If your ganache is still on the softer side, then maybe pop it back in the fridge for about 10 minutes. And you can start to see the build up of texture, and the more random the better. In fact, sometimes I'm putting on a little bit more ganache to achieve the same look as a tree trunk. So very natural, very organic, and this is also a great way to hide any lumps or bumps that the cake may have. I can also feel the more texture I'm building up, the thicker the ganache is getting, which is just adding to the effect. So as you can see, it's starting to look quite wood-like already. And now I'm going to go around the top, but rather than going in any random direction, I'm actually going to go in a circular direction, so it looks similar to the inside of a tree. So I'm going to turn my cake as I do this, just to make my life a little bit easier, building up texture and working my way into the centre of the cake. And it's starting to look really realistic. So you can see how much texture I've built up. So I'm going to pop this in the fridge for about half an hour because I want this to completely set before I go over with a layer of melted chocolate to enhance the texture even more. So the ganache is nice and cold, and here I've just got some melted chocolate, and I'm basically going to paint a thin layer of chocolate all over the cake. So I haven't tempered it. I actually think if the chocolate blooms slightly, it will only add to the tree-like effect. And if you don't know what bloom means, it's basically when the chocolate hasn't tempered and the fat sort of separates on the surface of the chocolate, so you get some lighter shades. Usually you don't want that to happen, but in this case, I don't mind it. And the aim is to add another shade of brown, add even more texture, and the chocolate's going to leave a really nice shine as well. I think it's a perfect finish to this cake. So once you've finished with the chocolate, it's good to just leave this out for the chocolate to harden. If it is very hot where you are, then I'd recommend putting this in the fridge because obviously chocolate doesn't like heat. But I'm going to leave this out until the chocolate's set before I do the last bits of decoration. So as lovely as my turntable was, I'm going to transfer the cake onto a nicer cake stand. I'm lucky enough to have access to some edible flowers, but you can pipe some buttercream flowers if you want, leave it plain, so you can get as creative as you want here. I'm going to simply stick with the flowers, and to attach them to the cake, I've got some more softened ganache, which is going to act like a glue to stick the flowers on. I've also got a few mint sprigs, just to give it some green as well. I just don't think you can beat edible flowers. Any excuse to add them to a cake, I'll take it. And there you go, I succeeded! I made a layered cake without any specific equipment. It's a really fun technique to try, so whether you're new to cake decorating or you have experience, I really love this effect so much. It looks really natural, and at the end of the day, it looks really appetizing too, which is what you want from a cake. So give it a go. If you do, please tag me at Georgia's Cakes on Instagram. As always, I love seeing your creations. Any more suggestions for further tutorials, then please write in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and we'll see you very soon.